Right. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Scott Osborne and I am the president of Royal United Services Institute here on Vancouver Island. Today's presentation is drawn from Mark Zuehlke's book, Terrible Victory, there's the book, and the Battle for the Scheldt in 1944. Mark is, of course, an honorary member of RUSI-VI, and this is his third presentation he's done for us. His previous presentations were in 2019. He did the Cinderella Campaign, 1st Canadian Army and the Battles for the Channel Ports. And that story is immediately preceding Mark's topic today on Terrible Victory. And he also did River Battles, Canada's final campaign in Italy, which he gave us in March 2020, just literally days before we were closed down for live presentations and meeting for lunch because of COVID-19. Now, today's presentation covers the lesser known story of the terrible fighting experienced by the soldiers of 1st Canadian Army in clearing the Scheldt Estuary and opening the port of Antwerp in the fall of 1944. Mark describes it as, and I quote, 1st Canadian Army's most important and costly campaign of the war, end quote. Opening the port of Antwerp was vital for supplies and ammunition to supply the Allied armies and enable them to further push into Germany and, of course, ultimately to win the war. 1st Canadian Army's mission, however, became doubly important after the failure of Operation Market Garden to achieve a breakthrough by sieging the bridge at Arnhem. So those operations take place at the same time or overlap. Now, Mark is going to talk about 40 to 45 minutes. Then I will pose about half a dozen questions, followed by questions from the audience, which is you. So please write your questions in the Zoom chat or Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and please make them brief and to the point. We end no later than 2:30 p.m. today, and a recording of this talk, as usual, will be made. It'll be posted to our website ASAP, probably in the next couple of days, and I'll send out a notification to all the members that the presentation has been recorded and it's available for viewing again, or you can pass on to your friends and acquaintances to come onto our website and have a look at that. So thank you, Mark, very much for taking the time to talk to us today. And if you're ready, please begin.
Okay, thank you, Scott. And thank you to RUSI Victoria for having me for this presentation. As Scott said, the presentation today is based on the book Terrible Victory. And as he also said, to fully understand why the Scheldt Estuary campaign developed the way it did, it's also necessary for us to segue back very briefly to the other Canadian battle series story that precedes it, the Cinderella Campaign, 1st Canadian Army, and the Battle for the Channel Ports. So, in the aftermath of the Battle of Normandy's End, with the closing of the Falaise Gap, the German army had been trying through the summer of 1944 to keep the Allies roped off in front of the invasion beaches. And in doing so, when the Falaise Gap closed down, that German force was virtually eliminated. No more than 50,000 Germans escaped, while approximately 400,000 had died, been wounded, or taken prisoner since the Allies had landed on June 6, 1944. Now, the remnants could only flee with the Allies nipping at their heels, particularly on the left flank of the Allied movement, 1st Canadian and 2nd British Armies of 21st Army Group, which were under command of the soon-to-be, with the 1st of September promotion, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. On the British flank, the Americans were blasting across open, generally flat terrain in a beeline for Paris, and there's nothing the Germans can do to even slow that advance. On August 25th, the French capital of Paris is liberated with little damage. The German garrison there, the commander of the German garrison in Paris, he ignored Hitler's orders that the city be burned. And here you can see on this map the Allied front line as of August 25th. And I'm just going to turn on the laser print pointer. And this is the Canadian line of advance over here, the dark line. And you can see how they hive off to the various ports as they make their way up the coastline. And you can also see this is 2nd British Army running over here. And then further over, we have the 3rd US Army doing their advance through to Paris and onward. On the left flank, where the Canadians are, and to some extent where the British Second Army is, there's the ground is much less friendly for the advance than where the Americans are. So the fighting is quite intense through this period as the Canadians come upward, even as they moved through to get to Rouen here. They were coming up through this country here, even getting up to the Seine River took quite a bit of fighting to get there. The Germans were able to use high grounds, woods, etc., rivers to slow down the Allied advance on that flank. But they couldn't stop the Americans at all because it was wide open country and the Americans just had a free run basically into Paris. Now, a momentous development for the Canadians was the liberation without a gunshot of Dieppe on September 1st. Responsibility for defending the Channel ports fell to German 15th Army Commander General Gustav von Zangen, who held no illusions that these ports could be transformed into undefeatable fortresses. But he realized that he was going to get orders from Hitler pretty quickly, declaring each port a fortress. Excuse me. This means the garrisons were expected to fight to the death and or the last bullet. And he knows this order is coming, so he directed the majority of his troops between the Seine and the Somme rivers to withdraw behind the Somme. The garrison at Dieppe, consequently, loaded everything it could aboard its horse-drawn wagons, and they bugged out of the city. As 2nd Infantry Division had been slaughtered in the disastrous August 19th, 1942 raid, it was given the honor of both liberating the town and conducting a formal march past led by their various bands on September 3rd. And this is a photo of that march past by the 2nd Division. The situation for the Germans, meanwhile, was only worsening. The evacuation by ferry and bridges across the Seine River, and this is Rouen pictured here. They were evacuating through Rouen. It had resulted in casualties almost as heavy as those suffered when the Falaise Gap was closed. About 100 tanks and armored fighting vehicles were destroyed and 1,500 motorized vehicles. So after this, 15th Army could offer no coherent resistance to the Canadian advance. Instead, bowing to Hitler's orders, von Zangen left pocket garrisons to defend the remaining ports, and he kept running, not just to the Seine, but ultimately clear out of France through Belgium, heading towards Holland. German strategy on the coastal front at this point becomes to reach and take refuge behind the Scheldt estuary, while the port garrisons are told to hold out to the last in order to deny their use to the Allies. The new line north of the Scheldt is also viewed as a temporary one, with the general expectation by German high command at this time that their forces in Holland will soon face being cut off from a retreat to the homeland if they stay there too long. So there's always a feeling at this point that they're going to leave. They're going to get out of Holland, fall back into Germany. On September 2nd, meanwhile, 11th British Armored Division rolls into Antwerp and liberates the largest European port with most of its docking facilities intact. It's a stunning achievement and one that unfortunately its value is immediately frittered away. Refusing pleas by the Belgian resistance to exploit the success by capturing the bridges and port facilities northeast of the city, 11th Division simply halts on the edge of the estuary. This is in part due to rapidly changing Allied strategic planning. Even as Antwerp, pictured here, the ports, is falling, Montgomery's intense interest in its potential to relieve the Allied supply problem that is still being hampered by supplies coming across Normandy beaches is waning. He envisions instead a bold master stroke, Operation Market Garden, that's going to vault the Allies, and particularly British Second Army, into the heart of Germany in time to win the war before Christmas. There's always this idea that you're going to win the war before Christmas, whichever war it is. Now, the American stereotype of Montgomery is of a slow, cautious, almost ponderous general. But there's nothing but audacity in Market Garden. It's an audacity he demonstrated earlier with offensives in Italy and Normandy. And he starts preparing this offensive typically without first getting approval from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces General Dwight Eisenhower. Monty's not going to risk losing 11th Armored Division's fighting edge to operations to secure all of Antwerp's port, nor was he going to commit his 30th Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks to the potentially lengthy process of clearing the Scheldt estuary from Antwerp to the sea. He needs both the division and the entire corps to lead the land advance in Market Garden from Eindhoven to Arnhem. And immediately he starts redeploying these forces to rallying points for the Great Offensive. On September 7th, Monty met Eisenhower, not as pictured here, but actually inside a bomber that carried Ike to the meeting at Monty's headquarters in Belgium. After some protracted argument, he swayed Ike to endorse Market Garden. Now, interestingly, a lot of armchair generals like to saddle Monty with full responsibility for Market Garden. But in his memoirs, Ike wrote that he approved the plan without hesitation, and he never regretted that decision. For 1st Canadian Army, Market Garden brings two conflicting and irreconcilable challenges. First, as Antwerp can no longer be quickly opened, capturing the French channel ports becomes a priority in the hopes that their limited capacity for moving supplies to the front lines can suffice to fulfill the needs of Market Garden and keep the American army at the same time moving as well. Second, the Canadians must also rapidly and decisively clear the Scheldt estuary so that Antwerp can be brought online. Reducing the fortress garrisons guarding the channel ports proves a slow and costly task. It's largely carried out by 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 1st British Corps, but also with commitment of 2nd Infantry Division on a failed attempt to win Dunkirk. While not getting into the details of this fighting, the result for the Scheldt Estuary campaign is that because of it, the operations in the Scheldt Estuary will begin with penny packet arrivals of 1st Army divisions to undertake jobs, while other divisions remain stretched along the French coast, winning each port city in turn, until the cities of Boulogne, which is pictured here, and Calais finally are taken, and 3rd Division will be free to move towards the Scheldt. That's not going to happen until October 1st, but the Scheldt Estuary campaign goes into full swing at the beginning of September 13th. So we now turn to the actual Scheldt Estuary campaign. And the title Terrible Victory, by the way, evolved from the fact that the campaign was largely unnecessary. Had 30th British Corps been allowed to advance beyond Antwerp to win the port facilities there, and then clear the north bank of the estuary to the sea, the entire operation would not have been required. With this opportunity lost, 1st Canadian Army is required to undertake what will be an extremely costly and grinding campaign in the worst conditions of weather and terrain imaginable. In the immediate aftermath of the failure to advance beyond Antwerp into Scheldt estuary, von Zangen and his superior Field Marshal Gerrit von Rundstedt realized that the crisis in Holland they had envisioned with playing out was now actually no longer coming to pass. Suddenly, they're handed a golden opportunity to deny the Allies the use of Antwerp. They act quickly and boldly by halting 15th Army to hold the estuary. At this point, von Zangen was still evacuating elements of 15th Army across the Scheldt from the port of Breskens in the port of Vlissingen on Walcheren Island. And then he was moving them towards escape routes deeper into Holland. Now, as 15th troops crossed the Scheldt from Breskens to Vlissingen, On ferries, they had a dragoon from the Belgian Dutch authorities. The troops reach the other side. They get off, and troops of the rested and battle-ready 70th Infantry Division troops, all with their equipment, cram aboard the ferries for the 3.5-mile voyage across the Scheldt to fortify and defend the southern bank of the Scheldt in depth from a position on the Leopold Canal northward. The German positions anchored on the Leopold Canal were hardened fast, and not only by the deployment of heavy artillery within what would soon be called the Breskens pocket, but also by gun positions across the Scheldt that could range on every inch of ground south of the estuary. Now, the 70th Infantry Division was rated by Allied intelligence as only capable of defensive action, but its troops were to prove determined opponents who could and would implement the normal German defensive tactic of immediately counterattacking Canadian troops who managed to throw them back from a defended position. They also worked effectively with the many advantages of terrain on the Scheldt estuary country, providing a defending force. And when you have good defensive positions and lots of MG-42 machine guns, ample ammunition, a division rated capable of defense can be a serious and effective opponent, and the 70th Infantry Division proves that. This map shows the entirety of the Scheldt estuary campaign from beginning to end. The most important thing to note here is the fact that all of 1st Canadian Infantry Corps, 1st Canadian Corps, is quite quickly embroiled as each division becomes available. And because of the terrain, each division operates largely independent of the others. In the Breskens pocket area, 3rd Division will eventually arrive beginning October 1st, and they'll be operating here. Over here, Polish Armored Division, 1st Polish Armored Division, was operating earlier. They get up to Terneuzen and free this part of the Scheldt estuary. And at that point, the Poles run out of steam. They've been fighting intensely ever since the beginning in the fighting in Normandy with the breakout. And unlike other divisions, and they are not in a position to bring in reinforcements from the rear. So they ultimately are running out of steam. They actually began recruiting from the front, whereby when they would take prisoners, they would see which prisoners were conscripts that the Germans had brought in from Poland. They would take off their German uniforms, hand them British uniforms, turn them around, give them British guns, and put them in the lines and say, all right, you're now fighting for us. It's, I think, probably the only time in history that that's been done, recruiting from the front. 2nd Division, meanwhile, will be operating up here, and they will carry the advance all the way over to Walcheren. And 4th Canadian Armored Division is over on their flank, operating up into this area to take Bergen-op-Zoom. Their operations are intended to cut off the Scheldt estuary country from reinforcement by the Germans from any other flanks. And then 1st British Corps, when it's done in the Channel Port clearing, comes up and moves up onto their right flank as well. So you can see all of 1st Canadian Army is now committed. There are no reserves, and the entire army is thrown into the maw of the battle. So it happens over phases, but eventually all of the army arrives here and goes into battle. The Scheldt estuary is a formidable obstacle in its own right. It's 80 kilometers long from the port of Antwerp to the North Sea. And although Antwerp is some way down the Scheldt River, and that then drains into the estuary, and that part of the river is fairly narrow. Once you get into the estuary, as you can see here, the waterway widens and provides ideal approaches for shipping. So general width is 3.5 to 5 miles wide, depending on where you are. Now, the Germans had heavily mined these waters, so bringing in naval vessels into the estuary to support the army operations is not possible. Now, the Dutch have a saying that God created the world, but the Dutch created Holland. And nowhere is this truer than the Scheldt estuary region of the country. Most of the landscape has been created by draining the sea off via a complex system of diking, whereby fields of varying sizes are created by pumping out the seawater and then surrounding them with dikes on all four sides. And this is defined as polders. Because the fields are still prone to flooding in rainy weather, most roads in the area are built atop the dikes. And these dikes generally run, as you'll see here, as you can see here, they generally run almost ruler straight. Engineers, Dutch are very good engineers, and they like efficiency, and they don't want to spend a bunch of time building in curves. So they build straight roads. And you can imagine trying to run your tanks and Bren gun carriers and trucks, etc., up those roads. If you've got Germans at the other end, they can fire straight down and pretty much knock them out at their leisure, or fire from across positions here and take them on the flanks. So it's pretty difficult landscape in which to move any kind of vehicles. And as a result, the Scheldt Estuary campaign, other than over in 4th Canadian Armored Division's operational area, which we'll visit soon, is going to be an infantry job. And that makes it extremely difficult. They can be supported by artillery, but very little armored support. On September 13th, the Scheldt Estuary battle begins in earnest, with the Algonquin Regiment of 4th Armored Division attempting to bounce the parallel Leopold and derivation de la Lys Canal with a surprise attack. Expectation is that those two canals will be only lightly guarded because Canadian intelligence had not yet realized that 70th Infantry Division had deployed to defend them. Although the Algonquins conducted a discreet reconnaissance up the canals, they were unable to see any German defenses. Now, the Algonquins go into the attack by dragging assault boats like this one, pictured here, along a muddy track from the village of Moerkirky to launch their attack. And they put in the attack shortly after midnight. Despite being met by instantaneous and heavy enemy fire, they established a viable bridgehead after first crossing the derivation, then dragging those boats up the intervening dike and down the other side, and paddling across the Leopold Canal to the opposite shore. As dawn broke, the 70th Division troops launched fierce counterattacks that ultimately just overwhelmed the Algonquins, and there was no ability to reinforce them. This led to a desperate retreat whereby the men swam for their lives behind covering smoke and shell fire provided by 15th Field Regiment's 25-pounder artillery. The regiment suffered a staggering 153 casualties. 29 of those were killed, 66 taken prisoner. That was I guess you'd call it the unfortunate introduction to what was going to be happening in the future of these operations. This debacle left 1st Canadian Army critically stunned. They realized they now faced a formidable foe where they'd been told that they could just pretty much walk over this countryside. Army Commander Lieutenant General Harry Crerar wrote, "The capture of Walcheren and the Beveland Islands is going to be a very tough proposition and require a lot of doing." Crerar decided he's going to leave the Breskens pocket for 3rd Infantry to deal with. And once it finished clearing the Channel Port duty, it will come forward to enter that fray. 2nd Division, meanwhile, is sent to Antwerp, and their job is to begin pushing north from Antwerp in order to get up to this entry point into the Beveland, South Beveland Isthmus area. And they're operating at this point pretty much on their own. Eventually, as the dates on this map would show, 4th Armored Division comes into the fray, and then 1st Canadian or 1st British Corps, etc. But initially 2nd Division is operating alone. On September 22nd, the Calgary Highlanders forced a crossing over the Antwerp Canal, and 2 of the regiment's snipers are pictured here. And they opened a path for 6th Infantry Brigade's South Saskatchewan Regiment and Fusiliers Mont-Royal to try and get over the Antwerp Turnout Canal that runs on a northeasterly track off the Albert Canal. Badly depleted by fighting in Normandy and before Dunkirk. And you can see here, this is the Antwerp Turnout Canal. With their severe losses, these 2 regiments are really only at about a company strength each. And many of its veterans are dead or wounded, and a heavy influx of raw recruits has been required to bring them even close to fighting strength. Their attack crumbles with heavy casualties concentrated among those newly deployed soldiers. Sending those poor devils into battle, South Saskatchewan Lieutenant Cecil Law said afterwards, was a crime. I wept over some of those poor kids. On September 25th, Crerar, the odd man out in this photo over here, was hospitalized for dysentery and a possible blood disorder. He was also by this time smoking a couple packs of cigarettes a day and showing symptoms of exhaustion. 2nd Canadian Corps Commander Lieutenant General Guy Simmons, on the other side of Monty, who's in the middle, takes command of the army. Now, this is the moment that Simmons has been waiting for, a chance to show his strategic and tactical skill without being fettered by Crerar, who he viewed as incompetent. Monty was also delighted, as he had long wished to get rid of Crerar in favor of Simmons. He also viewed Crerar as incompetent, and he considered Simmons a protege. Simmons, and you can see how they can look like proteges, but they both have the black armored beret that they fancied wearing. Simmons wasted no time. He set out a plan 2 days later that was to see 2nd Division cut the Beveland Peninsula, while 4th Armored Division would establish that blocking position east of Bergen, as I mentioned. There's another side to this. As a finishing touch, he decides on aerial bombardments that are going to breach Walcheren's dikes to inundate much of the island shortly before an amphibious invasion can happen. Flooding Walcheren meant inevitable destruction of property and loss of livestock, as well as ensuring some of the Dutch civilians living there would drown. The plan's controversial with many officers up the command chain. Some of them think it's morally wrong, but anxious to get Antwerp open, Eisenhower approves the sinking of the island as they described it, and his blessing comes on October 1st. The next day, thousands of leaflets are dropped from bombers across the island advising the residents to leave or head for higher ground. But there's nowhere most of the 50,000 civilians not already sheltering in the town of Middelburg, which lies on about the only high ground on the island, can go. The roads are already flooded by German defensive preparations, and Walcheren notably lacks higher ground. The island's actually a saucer, surrounded by its formidable dikes that keep the sea at bay. So when 252 RAF Lancasters appeared the next day to begin breaching those dikes, German troops and civilians alike are trapped. But the nature of the German bunkers is that they did claim any higher ground to achieve their fields of fire. So the Germans are isolated in pockets, but they're not drowned. That fate befalls many Dutch civilians. When the dike at West Capelle was breached and the town inundated by a wall of water, 125 civilians drowned there alone. While Walcheren's being savaged, 2nd Division is pushed out from Antwerp, and by October the 7th, it's coming up alongside the entrance to the peninsula, leading on to South Beveland. The first step in clearing the bank of the estuary is to win this entry into the South Beveland Isthmus. And here, an 18-day battle will ensue. Now, the reason this battle becomes so protracted is 2nd Division's brigades kick over a hornet's nest from which swarms the elite troops of a battle group named after its commander, General Lieutenant Kurt Chill. A paratrooper, most of Chill's forces are also Fallschirmjäger personnel, but German battle groups were always hybrids composed from whatever forces were easily at hand and destined to last only as long as an immediate crisis needed to be contained. What Fallschirmjäger troops particularly brought to the battlefield was a preponderance of firepower. Note that virtually every man in this photo is either armed with a submachine gun, a Panzerschreck, or a Panzerfaust. These 2 anti-tank weapons were also useful in knocking out infantry, machine gun, and other positions. Now, there's an abiding myth propagated by historians from Allied nations as much as by the Germans themselves, that Germany was ultimately defeated by its lack of munitions and other aspects of military supply. There's some truth to this, but it's also the fact that in these last months of the war, the Germans always are falling back on their lines of supply, and they lack nothing in ammunition and weapons. What they did lack was manpower and coherent unit organization, but their agility with battle groups helped offset these deficiencies. And as we've seen, the Canadians were also struggling with grave manpower shortages. The British were as well. The Americans had less of a problem here, but it still remained an issue. At times during the fighting at Hoogerheide and Landstrecht, 2nd Division artillery forward observation officers were unable to summon sufficient fire to adequately support the infantry because they just didn't have any ammunition. So the myth of massive material supply is just that. Ultimately, it was sheer determination by 2nd Division that won the day, and the Germans fell back to a raised railway connecting South Beveland to the mainland. From the ridge overlooking this position, 2nd Division paused to regroup, treat its wounded, such as this soldier from the Calgary Highlanders, and prepare to break into the peninsula. Here, the Calgary Highlanders are seen advancing out of Hoogerheide on October 27th. They marched through the same undulating rain that has dogged them throughout the fight. This stage of the battle ultimately just peters out in the aftermath of a disastrous attack put in by the Black Watch against the Germans behind that raised railway that I mentioned. That attack goes in on Friday, October the 13th. Advancing across open fields with little effective artillery support, the Black Watch was butchered, and they would refer forever to this day as Black Friday. 56 of their men died, 62 were wounded, and 27 taken prisoner. The Germans holding the railway were 6th Parachute Regiment men. They lost not an inch of ground, and they reported just 1 man killed. Now, recently, the Black Watch have been portrayed in a book as elite soldiers overcoming insurmountable odds at every turn. In reality, this regiment, in my mind, is the unluckiest and possibly the poorest led of all Canadian battalions in World War II. This partly stems from the loss of its senior officer cadre just prior to the disastrous assault on Verrier Ridge during the Normandy campaign. But endless setbacks followed after that due to a stubborn resistance to allowing skilled officers from outside the regiment to take leadership roles. And instead, they insisted on promoting from inside their own ranks and therefore lacked a certain amount of battleship leadership. East of the 2nd Division, 4th Armored Division had entered into a battle that also involved fighting Camp Group Chill and other forces. Now this time, the Germans were well equipped with tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and anti-tank guns, including a good number of 88s. The country here is different than the polders where the rest of the 1st Canadian Army was engaging, as it's operating on ground called the Brabant Wall. a unique feature of high ground rising to a huge height of 60 feet, which in Holland amounts to a lot. It's also sandy soil overgrown by managed forests, and its main features are the forests, and the roads through there are mostly just intended to enable loggers to go to work and bring cut timber out. So very poor roads. One of the biggest forests is pictured here. It's called the Woos Plantage, and it's in these woods that a good number of armored vehicles and armored tanks of the 4th Armored Division were knocked out by well-concealed anti-tank guns and armor as they just tried to push forward. Still, on October 27th, the tanks of the South Alberta Regiment and the Lincoln and Welland Regiment, which is the infantry, reached the outskirts of their objective of the ancient medieval town Bergen op Zoom. South Alberta's Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Swatty Witherspoon and Lincoln Lieutenant Colonel Bill Crom set up a headquarters outside of town to discuss whether to risk a break-in assault. They didn't like this idea because both feared getting mired in an Ortona-like battle that would destroy the place and cost a lot of casualties to their men. Finally, Witherspoon turned to Crum and said, "Hell, Bill, let's just take the damn place." Crum nodded, and they did exactly that, setting up their brigade and divisional headquarters in the Hotel Drac that dominated the ancient center square of the town pictured here. Except for offering a stiff fight for control of the river crossings on the north side of the town, the Germans let Bergen op Zoom fall to the Canadians rather than engage in a fight that they knew they couldn't win, and one that would ensure destruction of most of the city's historic buildings. While 2nd Division was winning this ground to begin an assault in South Beveland, and 4th Armored Division was completing its advance, this left the 15th Army troops defending the north side of the estuary cut off from further reinforcement and deeply limited in routes of supply for resupply. Now, 3rd Infantry Division at this point is coming into the Brescan pockets from the Channel ports. And with the lesson of the Algonquins behind them, they decided they would do a different kind of operation. So what they were looked at doing was the 7th Infantry Brigade would come across the Leopold Canal, where it splits away from the Derivation de Lys, and push their way in here. This is called, the operation is called Operation Switchback, and 7th Brigade was to establish a beachhead. 8th Brigade would then come in through that beachhead and advance up to the sluice here, which is another canal running down to Bruges. And at the same time, 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade would launch an amphibious operation out of the land captured by 1st Polish Armored Division from Terneuzen into a beachhead just outside of Hoofdplaat. And they would then advance across to Breskens to close off the ferry route across to Vlissingen and collapse the Breskens pocket that way. That was the plan. These arrows on here show how it didn't actually work, because it was a good plan, but it doesn't work. And the reason for that is that the attack across this canal, there we go. That attack is put in by the Canadian, Scottish, and Regina Rifles regiments with the Royal Winnipeg Regiment in reserve to strengthen the bridgehead. Achieving surprise was recognized as being impossible, and therefore they would have to come in daylight up to the canal and make their crossing. Again, the attack is going to entail battalions paddling assault boats across the canal to reach the opposite shore. So to support the attack, a lavish artillery program was planned, but the real supportive teeth was to come by way of the flames or wasps. These are Bren carriers mounted with flamethrowers. There were 27 wasps deployed to burn the opposite shore of the canal. And they were to do this just before the infantry launched their boats to paddle across. With an effective range of 120 to 140 yards, the Wasps could easily project their flame across the canal in what was dubbed a fiery rain. On October 6th, the attack went in at night with the Wasps illuminating the sky in a fiery glow. As the Wasps ceased flaming, the Canadian, Scottish, and Royal Regina Rifles lost my place, scrambled into salt boats and quickly gained the opposite shore. Heavy machine gun fire, however, shredded the canvas boats of the Regina Rifles in here. And then things went particularly bad for the Regina's D Company. Now, a Royal Montreal Regiment company, which normally served as headquarters security personnel for the division, had been swapped in for one of the Regina companies. And this was to enable the Montrealers to gain battle experience. They had never been in combat before. So it's again an indication of a tendency of Canadian intelligence to not take the German resistance that's going to happen here seriously. They're still underestimating what the Germans have thrown into the Breskin's pocket. So when the Montrealers go into action, 2 of their platoons are slaughtered on the water, and a third manages to cross unscathed. What remains of the Royal Montreal Regiment and D Company clung to the far bank, hoping for reinforcement. The Can Scots to the right, over here, their landing went very well. They ran into little resistance initially. So they get into position and they're feeling pretty good about things. But then the Germans do what I mentioned earlier. The 70th Infantry Division counterattacks in strength from all different angles that they can come down, with tanks and with heavy infantry. And pretty soon the Canadian Scottish are facing a threat to their survival. The Royal Regina Rifles are pinned down here. So they both end up pretty much just pinned on the riverbank and fighting for their survival. They're also under the Winnipeg Rifles, then come in and strengthen the bridgehead through here, but they can't make any forward gains. And that's partly because not only are they facing continual counterattacks, but they're also subjected to heavy artillery fire from coastal guns firing from positions 16 kilometers away that are pounding the positions. There's no chance of further gains. And suddenly Simmons realizes that to feed 8th Brigade into this beachhead will achieve nothing. So Operation Switchback undergoes an immediate redrafting, where 8th Brigade will now move over to where 9th Brigade was launching its amphibious operation, and that will become the main thrust that is put in. So we go back to here, and you can see there's 9th Infantry Brigade's initial assault will come there, followed 2 days later by 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade coming over and getting in behind them. And then these ones will together make a large attack down to clear the pocket, relieve pressure on the soldiers in the 7th Infantry Brigade here so they can then break out. So that's the general gist of how Operation Switchback is going to be put together at this point. Now, this operation had been twice postponed by weather and logistical efforts. It was supposed to be led by North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Highland Light Infantry. And they were going to move in buffalo-tracked amphibious craft from launch points at Terneuzen early on the morning of the 9th. The 2 9th Brigade battalions end up operating on pretty open water for buffaloes, and a number are swamped in the rough water. And one reason that amphibious operation had kept being pushed back was that the Canadians had to learn how to load and disembark from the buffaloes in their other amphibious vessel called a terrapin. The only available training area was a canal leading from Ghent in Belgium up to Terneuzen. So until they got out into the estuary, the Canadians had never been aboard these kind of vessels in such harsh seas. Lightly armored, the Buffaloes are powered by a radial aircraft engine, and on land they run on tracks, while in the water retractable scoops extend down from the tracks to provide propulsion. Top speed on water is 7.5 miles per hour, 20 miles per hour on land, and on paper 30 men could be crammed into a Buffalo. But it add in all their fighting kit and ensuring the Buffalo actually remained seaworthy resulted in smaller numbers being loaded aboard the ships. The 30 number was based on carrying a full platoon, but the Canadians are so under strength at this time, most platoons number only 15 to 20 men. So it ends up being possible to transport one platoon per Buffalo. The Terneuzens pictured here are the other amphibious vessel that was used. It's bigger and surprisingly more agile when it comes to climbing up dikes. Powered by two Ford V8 engines, it runs on 8 wheels with a pair of wheels set higher than the rest that gives it that ability to claw up steep dikes. It lacks any armament or attached weaponry, so it's intended more to arrive after the beachhead has been secured, carrying up to 4 tons of supplies. In the event, the Canadians used these to bring in the reserve 9th Brigade troops and then 8th Brigade. Now, expectation had been that this landing was going to be heavily opposed, but instead 9th Brigade achieved complete surprise and were soon standing on the dike looking out into the open country of the Breskens Pocket from their landing point at the village of Hoofdplaat. Before them laid the polders, filled with water and surrounded by dikes. The only line of advance was along the dikes, and soon enough, 9th Brigade found itself fighting for control of one dike after another. The Germans had been surprised, having concentrated their forces to contain 7th Brigade at the Leopold Canal. So for a short amount of time that is lost while they rejuggle and reinforce these positions, the Canadians are able to go forward. And what was to have been a fiant is now the main thrust. Yet they also had to keep troops fighting hard on the Leopold Canal to contain 7th Brigade. So the Germans are now extremely overextended. This, however, shows a typical fighting position created by 70th Infantry Division to meet the advance of 9th Brigade along the dikes in a drive to follow the coastline to Breskens. Machine guns and mortars are heavily used. The German troops fight with a tenacity that the Canadians grudgingly admired in all of their reports because these were supposed to be inferior troops. Ground was won, but it's won slowly and always at the cost of a few more men and killed for each and every polder. When possible, the Germans themselves would slip away at the last moment using darkness to fall back to the next dike to force yet a new firefight. Canadian troops, of course, were always very adept at night fighting. So they take to infiltrating up to the German strong points under cover of darkness. German troops tended to dislike operating at night, so this tactic enabled the Canadians to gain an upper hand by either attacking out of the darkness or emerging right in front of the enemy positions at dawn. In this way, the Canadians eventually push back. The Germans ultimately realize they can't win the fight for the pocket, and they start falling back towards Breskens. When 7th Brigade breaks away from the Leopold Canal, it's only a matter of time and killing to eliminate the pocket. On October 22nd, Canadian troops enter the streets of Breskens, pictured here, and the Germans in the pocket are left with no avenue of escape across the Scheldt to Vlissingen on Walcheren Island. What then ensued was a strange twist to the campaign. The Germans flee not northward, trying to get out of the estuary, but they flee south along the North Sea coast, with the Canadians in hot pursuit and themselves getting ever further away from the main German lines. They've got nowhere really to go, so they offer mostly a token resistance. But it was impossible to let down the guard, because some pockets of Germans also fought in their positions to the bitter end rather than surrender. The Canadians never knew which way a firefight was going to go. Attempts were made to utilize armor and truck convoys to speed the Canadian advance after the Germans. But again, the polders pretty much defeated these efforts. Not until November 2nd, with the Scheldt campaign drawing to a close, did the last German forces in the ever-shrinking pocket opt to throw in the towel and surrender well south of Breskens at a place called Knockheist. On October 28th, 2nd Division shook itself loose and began the advance into the isthmus that leads into South Beveland, and to push over to begin taking Walcheren Island. What followed was to be known as the South Beveland races. Knowing they had no chance of defeating the Canadians in this South Beveland island, because there's not a lot of defensible ground, the Germans give it away quite quickly, and they fall back on better defenses at Walcheren, particularly what's here. This is called the Walcheren Causeway, and it's the biggest the biggest obstacle that the Canadians faced in the Breskens area, in the South Beveland area, I should say, was just getting across bridges and canals and moving through this mud, the dreadful mud that they've been dealing with ever since the Scheldt Estuary battle began. But by September the 30th, they've secured South Beveland and are prepared to start fighting into the Causeway. This is a picture of the Causeway as it looked in 1944. It's changed a lot since then. They've widened it out a lot. Today, you wouldn't recognize it as being as narrow as this. It's called the Walcheren Causeway, or Slow Dam Walcheren in Dutch. And here the Germans know they can stand. They've spent years strengthening the defenses on the causeway's western end. And at the very exit, there's a long concrete wall they've built, which could be swiveled shut to entirely block the rail tracks and road. They've cut loopholes into the wall to enable firing from behind it. And on both sides of the causeway stretch high dikes, and into these networks of bunkers and gun slits that bristle with machine guns, similar to that photo I showed earlier of the defenses on the polder. The immediate defenses are held by 170th Pioneer Battalion, which is an engineering unit. Now, German engineers were not like British and Canadian engineers, because they first trained as infantry and then they became engineering specialists. Engineer battalions were more heavily armed than general infantry battalions, and they were often comprised of very tough veteran troops. This was the case with the defending 170th Infantry Division. The Germans deployed here in support of the engineering battalion total 1,000 men. The Canadian plan is necessarily simple. There's no choice really, but to advance one battalion at a time up the length of the causeway, with the intention of fighting through to the other side and establishing a bridgehead. Waiting on that other side are not only the engineers and other German troops, but gun batteries that are sighted down and able to fire the length of the causeway from one end to the other. This fall, a joint Dutch-British film was released about the Battle of Scheldt, and it was released in Canada via Netflix. It focuses entirely on the fight for the causeway, with no mention of any of the rest of the Scheldt Estuary campaign. And it's a strange story of a wandering British glider force soldier lost during the flight to Market Garden. He eventually shores up with the Calgary Highlanders. They give him a uniform and he participates in the Causeway attack. The battle scenes of the Causeway are very well filmed and capture the horror of the situation of getting across the Causeway. So it's a fairly good war entertainment, but it's pretty bad history. Still, you might want to look it up on Netflix. It fell to the hapless Black Watch again to put in the first assault. Predictably, they were repulsed with heavy losses and nothing to show for the effort. The mantle then passed to the Calgary Highlanders, and October 31, B Company's 100 men led the advance. They moved quickly through darkness while artillery pounded the German positions, but then the Germans let loose with MG fire and artillery fire, wherein 88mm shells, armored piercing, screamed in, and rather than exploding, actually pinwheeled through the ranks of the men. At 0300 hours, the attack crumbled. There was no respite. Behind a creeping barrage, D Company headed along the Causeway. Their commander, Major Bruce Mackenzie, a legend within the regiment, yelled to the men, "Come on, you sons of bitches." And come on at dawn, they did. At 0652 hours, they went into the jaws of hell and they went clear through the fire to the other side. By 9:30, Mackenzie signals that his men are past the Causeway. The rest of the battalion race forward, but there's no hope at all for the badly cut up Calgarys. The Germans lashed back with a head-on counterattack supported by tanks. Each company now fielded no more than 20 men. Lieutenant Colonel Ross Ellis ordered a retreat, but one that gave ground grudgingly. The men took most of their wounded out with them. The regiment de Maisonneuve tried to shore up the situation, but they only lost more men. 5th Brigade's attacks cost 135 killed, wounded, or missing. The Calgary Highlanders suffered 65 casualties, of which surprisingly only 18 were killed and 45 wounded. The remains of 2 of the men were never found. They were presumed obliterated by a 220mm shell strike. In the aftermath, the Black Watch pictured here buried their dead, and their pipe and drum band honored them during the funeral. Today on the Causeway stands a monument to the Canadians who fell here. Walcheren ultimately fell to amphibious operations launched on the opposite side of the island by Royal Marines and commandos. Also, the 52nd Lowland Division discovered a spot south of the Causeway where a battalion was able to slip across the murky waterway in assault boats and then struggle on foot across 1,500 yards of deep mud to reach the island. The move entirely surprised the Germans, and Walcheren soon fell, bringing an end to the Battle of the Scheldt. The Calgary Highlanders returned to this monument regularly in order to pay tribute to their fallen, and they were doing a tour a year coming here until COVID struck. On November 28th, the first supply convoy sailed up the Scheldt River, the estuary, and then the river to Antwerp. And as the way of these things go, with the Canadian Army being known as the Cinderella Army, no Canadians were invited to the welcoming ceremony or ball. But by chance, the first freighter that docks is the SS Fort Cataraqui, pictured here in Antwerp. It's a Canadian freighter. Canada paid a terrible price for a campaign that might have been avoided. From October 1st to November 8th, almost 13,000 had been killed, wounded, or gone missing, and half of these were Canadians. It had been truly a terrible victory, and one that I think we really need to remember. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mark. I got a couple of questions I'm going to pose to you. And firsthand Canadian veterans' accounts describe the fighting in the Scheldt as constantly wet, more difficult, more terrible, to use your word from the title of your book, than the fighting in Normandy. Field Marshal Montgomery described the campaign as fought, and I quote, under the most appalling conditions of ground and water, with the advantage to the enemy, end quote. Your last presentation to us before we broke for COVID was river battles in northern Italy. And of course, that was seemingly endless river crossings through overflowing rivers under constant rain showers with painful close quarter fighting. River battles also takes place at the same time as the clearing of the Scheldt. So it may be difficult to compare, but what is your sense of which was the tougher fight, clearing the Scheldt or river battles?
I think it was the clearing of the Scheldt. This was the winter of 1944-45 begins early. It actually sort of almost begins in September. And it's going to be the worst winter in 50 years in European history. And that weather extended down into northern Italy, where the Canadians were fighting at the river battles. But in the north part of around Holland and Belgium, the rain was horrendously heavy, and it just transformed the terrain into this mud. There was also the polders that changes the thing. In the river battles, they're crossing a river, but once you get to the other side, at least the ground is somewhat, it's muddy, but it's passable. Here, every time there is no real river, there's just these polders constantly. And so you're always operating on the dikes and the exposure to the fighting. So I think, that's why when you look at it, the Scheldt Estuary costs a far heavier butcher's bill than did the river battles, although the costs down there were pretty heavy as well. They're both battles that have been largely ignored in the Canadian history study of Canada in World War II, and but they have a lot of similarities.
Okay, thanks for that. You used the term the Cinderella Army several times, and in fact, you used that word Cinderella in your book on the clearing of the Channel ports, called it the Cinderella Campaign. Operation Market Garden, on the other hand, in spite of being a striking failure, was turned into, of course, a very popular movie starring Sean Connery and Michael Caine and others, entitled A Bridge Too Far. And so that movie became so popular that basically anybody who thinks they know anything about the history of the Second World War at least knows about the airborne assault to take the bridge at Arnhem. No movie, of course, was made about the Cinderella Army, even though the battle for the Scheldt was certainly hard won, and it was a significant victory as opposed to a striking failure. And of course, a Cinderella by definition is someone who gets all the dirty work, but is never invited to the ball. Why do you think were Canadian soldiers and First Canadian Army's efforts in Northwest Europe and even in Italy seemingly forgotten?
I think initially it's the American, history being told by the Americans and by the British, and they just were focused on their own nationalities, and the Canadians don't warrant a mention in their view. Canada, I feel and felt one of the reasons I got into doing the Canadian Battle Series was I felt that the Canadians, we hadn't done a good job of telling our own history. And so rather than expecting the American historians and the British historians to include us, we had to come out and tell our own history. And that's what I've been doing for these 13 books. And, I think we're seeing a change there. We're seeing in Canada, I think most Canadians have, well, I shouldn't say most Canadians, but a good number of Canadians now have more of an understanding of what Canada did in World War II. We won't probably get those big budget films because the cost of making that kind of film is extraordinary. The Forgotten Battle that the Dutch British did, it's either the first or second most expensive film the Dutch have ever made. It's got 2 battle sequences, really. And that's one of the things is battle sequences are extremely expensive. And so you can kind of have one at the beginning of the film and one at the end. And you can't really do a bridge too far thing where you got battle running all the way through the entire film. The millions and millions and millions that cost must have been astonishing.
Okay, thanks for that. General Crear, commander of 1st Canadian Army, as you indicated, he caught dysentery and was replaced by Lieutenant General Guy Simmons, who became acting commander, 1st Canadian Army, from the 27th of September to the 9th of November, which for all intents and purposes covers almost all the entire Scheldt campaign.
That's right.
Given Crear's poor relationship, which you touched on with Montgomery, and Simmons' excellent relationship as kind of a protege of Monty, if Crear had not become ill, so I'm asking you to kind of speculate a little bit here,
Mhm.
but remained as commander of 1st Canadian Army, would the Scheldt campaign, do you think, have unfolded differently? And was Monty's negative assessment of Crear's generalship fair?
I think the campaign would have taken longer. Crerar was a very methodical general, which becomes extremely worthwhile with the Battle of the Rhineland that will follow in February, March 1945. But he would have wanted to do it really the Monty way, have a large artillery prep on each attack, lots of pushing around the flanks, and then much more broad-based attacks. Simmons was much more willing to just toss individual battalions into the fray, and demand that his divisional commanders do that. Once the Battle of the Breskin's Pocket is collapsed, he actually replaces Major General Dan Spry of the 3rd Infantry Division for what he considers being too timid in throwing away battalions. Simmons had a very hard side to him. He could put a battalion in with an expectation that it was going to be chopped to pieces and not seem to have any remorse about that kind of action. Crerar found that much, much harder. I think Monty always underestimated Crerar, but they were such totally different personalities. Crerar was methodical. He loved detailed written orders. Sometimes his order reports, as you'll see them in the archives, run up to 50 pages that he was handing out to the divisional commanders, telling them what to do. Monty would say, I want you to take that feature over there. And that would be kind of, and they'd leave it to the divisional commander to figure it out. Crerar just couldn't bring himself to do that. He was just too detailed. He and Simmons were such polar opposites that the debate about which one of them was the better general will probably go on forever. I think Simmons was the right man for the Estuary campaign, and I think Crerar was the right man for the Rhineland battles. So it's, kind of, they both had their strengths.
Okay, thanks. Regardless of the success or failure of Operation Market Garden, the need to clear the Scheldt and get supplies flowing into Antwerp remained, win, lose, or draw at Market Garden. Was Monty too fixated on seizing the bridge at Arnhem to the detriment of Canada's future clearing of the Scheldt? And did Monty miss the importance of cutting off the Beveland Peninsula? Or perhaps did Monty just expect German troops to continue to escape off the Beveland Peninsula and thus reduce the forces available to defend the Scheldt?
That's an interesting question. The expectation that the Germans may be running and that they might just keep on running. I think that did influence his decisions. He did not want to send 11th Armored Division up there to try and clear the entrance to the Beveland Peninsula. It would have taken their strength away from Market Garden and 30th Corps. All of that would have been reduced. So he couldn't really have it both ways. If he was going to have Market Garden, he couldn't do what he should have done in the Scheldt Estuary. So it really came down to which was more important. He was so convinced that he would be able to pull Market Garden off that it's really a calculated gamble that he takes at that point. He's gambling that he's going to get to Arnhem, break into Germany, and what's happening over here in Holland isn't going to matter. And he can leave it up to the Canadians to to do that, and with the resources that he's not going to give them, because he took the largest share of the supplies and moved it over to Market Garden. So the Canadians, once again, are in that Cinderella position. They're given an almost impossible task and not a lot of resources to carry it out with. So that also impacts them all the time in this operation. First Canadian Army is in a pretty bad straits by the time it gets out of Normandy, does the Channel Ports clearing, and goes into this battle. There, as I've said, there were battalions that were fielding 150 to 200 men instead of 800 and some. Companies were, sometimes 20 and 30 men. They're really weak, and yet they still win the Scheldt Estuary.
Okay, thanks for that. You touched on this before during your presentation, but there was and continues to be some debate over the morality of Lieutenant General Simonds' decision to use the RAF Bomber Command to bomb the dikes and subsequently flood Walcheren Island. As you indicated, the flooding caused great suffering and deaths, significant number of deaths to the local Dutch civilian population, because as you quite rightly pointed out, there was nowhere to flee to for them in many cases. But given that Simonds made that decision to bring in the RAF Bomber Command and to bomb and subsequently to flood Walcheren Island, do you think it was the right decision to flood Walcheren?
This is what I've struggled with over the years, because, when you look at what happened to the Dutch population there, there was a large loss of life. There also, it took many years for Walcheren Island to be restored. They had to get rid of all the salt water and drain that out and build the dikes back up. So it was many years getting the island back on its feet. However, the Germans had a very strong defensive position in the island. They had lines of communication between their strong points, one to the other. When the island was flooded, they lost that ability, and it was much harder for them to move troops from one part of the island to another part of the island. So I think in the end game, there would have been a lot heavier casualties suffered by the Canadians, and more importantly, because it was the British Lowland Division and the Royal Marines and the Commandos who ultimately take Walcheren. They would have lost a lot more men. So it's one of those risky decisions where you have to decide, are you willing to accept civilian deaths and damage in order to save losses of your army personnel? And Simonds made that decision that the army personnel being saved was more important. And I think he's basically right in that decision. Interestingly, when I've visited Walcheren Island, which I've done a number of times, the Dutch seem to also believe that it was the right decision. There's not a lot of recrimination for what happened. There's sorrow that it happened, but generally they blame the Germans.
Okay, thanks for that. Just before we go to questions from the audience, and we do have a few questions from the audience, do you have any final comments or thoughts you wish to offer us about 1st Canadian Army's fight to clear the Scheldt in 1944?
I think the main one that I've always come back to is the way the battle developed in such a way that it really was this piecemeal kind of approach to it. So you can imagine Crerar going crazy trying to, it just would not have been his way of doing things. That in spite of that piecemeal way of getting into it, the individual battalions responded very, very quickly and well to the challenges that were presented to them. And the Scheldt Estuary is a real example of a battle that's won at the battalion, company, and platoon level. You see time and time again where it's really somebody like Sergeant Crocker of the Calgary Highlanders who wins the crossing across the Albert Turnout Canal by, they running across a lock and seizing the other side. So that individual initiative of the general soldier really rises to the top in this campaign.
Okay, thanks for that. First question is from Chuck Oliviero, and he says, and I quote here, looking at the map, and I think he's talking about the big map that shows the Breskens Pocket and the Scheldt Estuary and whatnot. And if you could call that up, that would be good. I'm left wondering why we felt obliged to clear the estuary as opposed to holding along a line, say, Antwerp, Rotterdam, Hague, for example, and leaving the German forces in the Scheldt to wither or force an attempt at a naval evacuation.
Yeah, there we are. I just need to, are you seeing that there?
No, I'm not.
Okay, I got it. I think I should skip that.
Okay, just answer it as best you can without the map. So
yeah, the biggest problem is if you don't take that area from the entrance to the Beveland Peninsula across to Walcheren Island, there's no way you can open up the port of Antwerp because you can't move ships down the estuary. They would just be able to be sunk by guns off of there. So isolating the estuary was an option, but then we couldn't use the port. And the general Allied plan was they desperately needed that port so they could stop having to bring supply in from the Normandy beaches and then driving it all the way up to wherever the front lines were at that point. So they pretty much had to. This was a campaign that really had to be fought because the only way of opening up the Antwerp port is to take it.
Okay, what was, just as a follow-up to that, what was the timeline, the gap between the fall of Walcheren Island and thus the clearing of the Northern Scheldt and the time to the first naval convoy? Because didn't the British Navy have to come in and clear the estuary out of naval mines? And didn't that take some time?
Yes, it did. And but we were, so the battle ends basically November 5th. The first convoy comes in November 28th. So we've got what, 23 days.
So about 3 weeks.
Yeah, it took about 3 weeks for the clearance of the mines to take place. So that's pretty quick. And then the port itself was entirely intact. None of the cranes and docks and that had been severely damaged. So as of November 28th, the port is in full operation. There's still the railroads going out of Antwerp were another matter. It took quite a while to rebuild those, but they were able to use roads and stuff pretty quickly to get supplies to the British and Americans.
Okay, got a question here from Leonard Jenks. What role, if any, did air bombardment play, for example, Walcheren Causeway, Walcheren Island? So can you expand a little bit on the bombing of the dikes?
Walcheren Causeway, they never did any bombing on the causeway itself. It was so narrow that the bombers couldn't pinpoint it, and the weather was such that in those days, the October 30th to November 5th, that there were no bomber operations possible at that point. It was just not flyable conditions. So it's actually hindered quite a lot through the entire operation of Scheldt Estuary campaign. There were very few good flying days for the Air Force. We see far less in the way of fighter bomber support than we had in Normandy. For much the same reason. It was we were getting kind of ahead of the good basis for bombers to operate from. They were having a lot of trouble in Belgium with just the conditions of the airfields that they were trying to get operational. So air support is very poor in the Scheldt Estuary, and it remains that for the entire campaign.
I got a question from Andrew Christie. And he says, I am surprised by your comments re the Black Watch and our, and you can infer that he's affiliated with the Black Watch, our regimental leadership. It certainly disagrees with both Whitaker's and Hutchison's commentaries in their books on that. Can you comment further on that?
No, I agree. I actually knew I was going to step into this. Yes, well, Hutchison was that Black Watch. And Whitaker, like, what I'm not taking away is like the battalion fought very bravely, but my sense from what I've looked at studying first the Verrier Ridge operation, we have that moment when the real leadership of the Black Watch is eliminated by artillery fire German that they that caught them at an O group. And after that, they have pretty junior officers in charge, and the Verrier Ridge attack is not well put in. And then once Verrier Ridge is behind them, we do see there were several attempts to bring in kind of command leadership from outside of the Black Watch to take over leading the regiment, and the regiment resisted effectively and was able to promote from inside. And I'm not convinced that that was the best decision. I understand the loyalty to the regiment, but I think their leadership did lack in that aftermath. They tended to put in attacks again and again and again in a kind of World War I fashion of just lining up and going forward into the teeth of hell. Because they do this again in the Rhineland and are shot to pieces again. So I think maybe they would have benefited from having a better someone from outside who had more overall battalion command experience.
Did the other Canadian battalions that obviously had, similar casualties throughout the campaigns there, were they more open than the Black Watch to allowing outside people to come in and command the battalion or take over companies?
Yeah, there tended to be a real flow of back and forth between battalions of officers being swapped in. Those decisions being made by the divisional and brigade commanders. And sometimes those were resisted, and sometimes they were viewed as a negative. But largely, when you look, setting aside regimental honor and looking at, does this maintain a good, effective fighting unit? The result is that it does. And you look at some of the junior, the majors who could have possibly been promoted to lieutenant colonel. Would they have made as good a commander? It's not as clear. And sometimes when you move a major up to lieutenant command colonel, you see them fail quite badly. Other times they really rise to the challenge and become brilliant. So it's always that thing too, you make the divisional and brigadiers make these decisions, and they can be right or wrong on it. But if you brought in an officer from outside and they didn't perform well, they were usually kicked out really fast. And then was either from inside or another officer would be brought in.
Sink or swim, as they say. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Chuck Oliviero, just as a comment here, he points out that Crerar was, of course, a World War I vet and was probably certainly scarred by the significant and large numbers of casualties from fighting in the First World War. And that's his thought. And he also points out that Simmons was, of course, wasn't commissioned until 1925. So he's really a post First World War officer. So he fortunately misses that. Did you have any thoughts or comments on that observation?
I think that's actually really true. One of the reasons Crerar was so unpopular with Montgomery is Crerar, and there's a biography of him actually called A Thoroughly Canadian General, right, that was released a few years ago. I think that's a really important thing always to look at, is that Crerar was a very strong Canadian nationalist, but he was also a very strong advocate for keeping Canadians alive in the fighting. And he, I think that did come out of his World War I experiences. You see that with quite a lot of the officers who had World War I experiences, that they were much more inclined to try and conduct battles in a way that did not result in heavy casualties, if they could do so, within reason, and so I think that was an aspect with Crerar. He was not going to fritter away Canadian lives if he could avoid it. And there's a certain view that the British tended to view us all as colonials and somewhat as cannon fodder. And so there was that. I think Crerar actually would have seen that as being true.
Okay. I'm just looking here. I don't see any more questions. We're getting close to 2:30 p.m. I just want to thank you, Mark, for an excellent presentation. It was very illuminating on the Scheldt campaign. Doesn't answer every question, of course. You need to read the book and do a lot more thinking about it in order to do that. Your presentation certainly highlights, though, that 1st Canadian Army and Canada's soldiers truly were the Cinderella Army. They don't get enough credit for the very difficult fighting they endured throughout Northwest Europe, and certainly not in clearing the Scheldt. But certainly your books have helped to do that and to illuminate that issue and give them some justifiable and well-deserved credit. The Scheldt is certainly an important but almost forgotten story of the Second World War. So thanks again, Mark, for writing the book and, of course, coming and doing this presentation. For your time and effort in putting it all together and answering questions today for both RUSI-VI members and any guests in our audience. So again, Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And we'll end that right now. And we should have it recorded in the next couple of days, and that'll go out to all the membership. So everybody will be able to review the presentation again if they so wish. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks.